I was doing some research last winter in preparation for this lecture, and I was looking through books of Rhode Island business history. I came to a book by a man by the name of Hall, and as I flipped through, the various business people whose biographies were included had, say, a quarter page or a half page dedicated to them in terms of a picture of their mill or business or whatever. Then I turned to this page, and these were the Knights. There are 16 mills here. At this time, the Knights were the largest cotton textile manufacturing firm in the world. And they had over 11,000 looms, of which 4,500 were dedicated to making fruit of the loom products, and they employed almost 7,000 people. So this was an incredible enterprise of which I had no idea until I started reading about them. The first mill that they owned was the Pontiac Mill. And here we are, an old picture probably from the early 20th century, and on my right, a picture that I pulled off the internet, which is perhaps dated to the last 10 years. I don't know if any of you have ever been there to this mill, which is very close to the Warwick Mall, but it certainly looks, it did look when I last saw it 10 or more years ago as rundown as you see it here. Sorry? So, who were the Knights, and how did they come to Elmwood, and how did we come to have this amazing library building here on Elmwood Avenue? These are the two brothers who formed B&B and R. Knight in 1852. Benjamin was the older. He, at the age of about 18, went to work in the Sprague Print Works, which later became Cranston Print Works, and was owned by the Knights beginning in 1888. He worked in the mill for 2 years, and then he went back to pursuing other business interests. He began a grocery store near the Cranston Print Works, and eventually he expanded into dealing in grain and other businesses. His brother Robert also began working in the mills just about at the same time in the early 1830s. Robert was 8 years old when he began working at the Cranston Print Works. He worked there and at another mill for a total of 8 years, and then he decided he wanted an education. So he went back to school for 1.5 years, and after that became a teacher briefly, and then followed his brother into business. In 1850, he bought a half interest in the Pontiac Mill, and with another investor. In 1851, that investor left, and that half was bought out by Benjamin, his older brother. And in 1852, they changed the name of the mill to Pontiac, and they became the B&B and R. Knight Company. And we know that all is history after that. So, how did the Knights happen to be in Elmwood? At this time, in the mid-19th century, Elmwood was an amazing place to live. It began to be full of urban estates, beautiful large tracts of land with very impressive mansions. Robert Knight moved here in 1863. He purchased the mansion, let me see. He purchased the mansion that you see here in 1863 and moved on to Elmwood Avenue. The house had apparently been built in 1855. You see below the current view, which is the parking lot just to the south of the library. And thank you to Kate Wells for this wonderful image which she shared with me. Behind both buildings, you see the Gilbert Stewart Middle School. So that means that the picture of the mansion has to date to the 1930s at least, because the middle school wasn't built until the 1930s. So, Elmwood was a lovely place to live. As I said, from the 1850s on, it began to be filled with more and more mansions. In the 1860s, horse cars began running up and down Elmwood Avenue. This meant that the neighborhood was far more accessible to the center of the city. So Robert Knight could live here. Benjamin Knight, by the way, lived on Broad Street, right about where the classical high school playing field is now. They could both get to their downtown office in Washington Row very easily from here. You can see from the picture that I have up that this was a really lovely place to live. And to emphasize that, we have sheep grazing down near the Roger Williams Park. And you can see the trolley line here. Electrical trolleys replaced the horse cars between 1892 and 1894 on Elmwood Avenue. And this is the point at which people really start moving into the neighborhood and the population really becomes denser. And more houses are being built. So I want to run through the city atlases very quickly, that these demonstrate that point very easily. This is the 1882 atlas. Let me see. Okay. Now, okay, fine. Long Pond, okay. Long Pond was filled in the 1890s. Here you have between Moore and Henry Streets, wait a minute. Yes, there's a property that eventually the Knights will own. Between Moore and Dable Street is Robert Knight's mansion and a wonderful tract of land that backed onto Long Pond. Turn to 1895, and here you have, oh, sorry, I hit that too quickly. Okay, no. Okay, here you have Robert Knight's mansion again between Moore and Dable. Henry Street has changed its name to Princeton, and a second mansion exists here, which I believe around this time began to be inhabited by Clinton Prescott Knight, one of Robert's two children. Over here is the structure that may have stood on the site of the Webster Knight House, 118 Princeton. There's a record that there was a structure there, but it apparently was replaced in the period 1895-96. Robert Knight built two houses for his two sons. From this time on, his sons are managing the textile business for him. This is the 1908 City Atlas, and you can see, whoops. Okay. This is a very light touch, and I keep touching the remote instead of the flashlight. So here you have Elmwood Avenue, here you have Broad, here you have Trinity Square, and you can see how much more densely the area is populated than it was in the previous maps. Moving forward, here you can finally see the Robert Knight mansion again on this block. The Clinton Prescott Knight mansion would be here on the block that's numbered 16. The pages are cut off in the city atlas, and so I was only able to take a photograph of this one. But please also note that there are many properties belonging to Robert Knight in the vicinity. He owned large tracts of land in the whole area, and gradually, from 1908 on, the property is sold off, so that by the 1920, you see far less owned by Robert Knight, and that is Robert Knight and family. It becomes Robert Knight Realty in 1912 after he dies and the family takes over the property. So, who were these people who were inhabiting the Elmwood area? We had very high-level managers from manufacturing companies such as Gorham. We had all sorts of builders, of very skilled artisans, of very well-to-do businessmen who enjoyed living in this area and having easy access to their workplace, a place like Gorham, the Gorham Mill, or to downtown where they ran their businesses. One person who I'll speak about a little bit further down, a little bit later, is Frederick Shaw, who was a contractor, who owned a beautiful house at 126 Melrose. Be sure on the walking tour that you walk by it. And this is my factoid of the day. The brewers, German brewers, were living in this neighborhood because the Narragansett Brewery was built on Cranston Street in Cranston, beginning in 1890. And so we even had Germans in the neighborhood. So after Robert Knight died in 1912, his two sons continued the business. Webster's wife, Sarah, became very involved with the library group that founded the Elmwood Public Library. In 1915, the children's librarian at Providence Public had tea with the ladies of Elmwood and informed them that the reading levels of the children of Elmwood were very poor, and the ladies immediately decided that they were going to do something about this. So as in the case of RISD, it took a whole committee of women to do this. They began in April of 1915. They created these leaflets. Whoops. Okay. You can see their name. Okay. It's a very sensitive touch. I apologize. You can see their names here. Mrs. Frederick Shaw, Mrs. Webster Knight is there, and others of the women who continued to be active for a very long time in this group. On your right-hand side is an outline, the first page of a typescript that I found in the archives that tells the history of the founding of the library. So the ladies went literally door to door, petitioning for dollar donations to form a public library. They collected approximately $600, I believe, and they were given the right to occupy without rent the second floor of the Greenwich Street firehouse that no longer exists. This is at the corner of Greenwich Avenue and Burnett Street, for those of you who live in the neighborhood or want to find the location. This was a very successful and very active library, as you can see from this picture. It served a wide variety of people in this community, and at a certain point, the Knights apparently decided that they would move forward with building a really serious building to replace what the Elmwood Public Library Association had in the firehouse. This began apparently around 1919. By 1921, Edith Knight, who was Robert Knight's spinster daughter, had died and had left the amount of $125,000 in her will for the founding of a library. By 1922, the family is ready to make a public announcement that this library will be a memorial to Robert Knight, and it will serve the Elmwood Public Library Association. Mrs. Shaw, the president, is here. Mrs. Babcock, who was another officer on the board of the Elmwood Public Library, is here. The librarians are here. Here is Robert Knight's mansion. The site for the new building for the library is here. And an interior view of the building, I think, at Greenwich Street. And of course, our firehouse down at the bottom. Here we have the the laying of the cornerstone on the left-hand side, and on the right-hand side, we have the invitation to the actual dedication of the building in May 1924. Please note here that the person to whom you RSVP is Miss Adelaide Knight. This was the spinster daughter of Webster Knight. Edith Knight, before her death in 1921, and Adelaide for a long time after, were two of the women who were very involved both in this library, and Adelaide was involved in the Pontiac Library, which was founded near the Pontiac Mill and was donated by the Knight family as well. So here's the library in the record. It was a published picture of May 1924, and again, there. You can see from the outside that it adheres to a classical plan. The doors are beautiful. So when you leave, please take a look at the bronze doors. They're fabulous. And there are acroteria, there are classical ornaments along the top of the roof, which you cannot see from the street level, but I have seen them and they exist. Also note all of the elms. The elms were not taken down because of elm disease. They were taken down in 36 or so because of the widening of the street. You can see the trolley tracks in the front of the picture. The architect for this building was Edward Lippincott Tilton. He was the foremost architectural specialist in library buildings in that period. He innovated what's called the open floor plan, and he came out of New York. The Knights decided to hire a New York architect rather than a local Providence architect. So just to refresh your memory, this is the mansion. Oh, God. Okay. I don't have a good touch for this, obviously. This is the mansion. And the library would appear here. This is a good front view because you can get an idea of how lovely the setting was in the 20s and 30s. Now, the house was occupied by Adelaide Knight and by other family members, apparently. According to Robert Knight's request, nobody but a family member could live in the house. And so in 1949, the family finally sold the property and had the house demolished. Yeah, really, really sad. And the article in the 1949 Projo talks about how people came in and bought staircases and railings and chandeliers to recycle. The Knights, despite the fact that they move out of the neighborhood around 1920, still retain an active interest in the library. This is an invoice for books that Sarah Lippitt Knight bought for the library in 1929. She built the art book collection, she built the Rhode Island collection, and she built the genealogy collection here, all of which are quite noteworthy. Finally, the inside of the building. Now, what Edward Lippincott Tilton did was to move the stacks away from the center of the floor plan in a library and open it out so that circulation and so that people could circulate and people could sit and read and so forth. The stacks in this building are 3 stories deep. They are sunk behind that wall and below the main level of the library. It's a cast iron structure and it supports the floor, and I assume, you can ask Jim Barnes this question, but I assume it also supports the overall structure in some way as well. So here you see the classical tradition that Tilton carries out within the interior. You have a colonnade around an atrium, as you would in a Roman house. You have a skylight, which currently is closed. Above the colonnade, you have a plaster cast of the Parthenon frieze. And the building also is full of wonderful stained glass, which we'll see in a moment, wonderful wrought iron work, and many, many meticulous details. The furniture that appears upstairs, that still is in use upstairs, appears to be the original oak furniture because it agrees with old photographs that are in the archives. The wrought iron work and a better view of the frieze, and you can see the wonderful coffered ceiling al antica there. This appears over the 2 end spaces at the north and south ends of the library. This is the fireplace in the children's reading area. The tiles are made after the Baby's Opera by Walter Crane, published in 1877, and they are all illustrations of nursery rhymes. You can see the use to which the fireplace was put. It served as a storytelling corner. in the library in the 20s and 30s. The children's library, by the way, is through the corridor and to the south end of this floor. Now, if you stand on one mezzanine upstairs and look across to the other, again, you can see the frieze, you can see the colonnade, and you can see a portrait of Robert Knight. On the mezzanine are two portraits. On the opposite side, it would be here, is a portrait of Josephine, his wife. So the building bears a plaque as you come in through the main entryway, through the bronze doors, that states the dedication to the parents, to Robert and Josephine Knight. And the dedication is written by Webster Knight, Clinton Prescott Knight, Sophie Knight Rousmaniere, and Edith Knight, who by 1924 was already deceased, but had made a significant financial contribution to the building of this building. Now, the space that we're standing in for this photograph is called the Webster Knight Library or the Webster Knight Office. That name doesn't appear on the original drawings, but it's what we've always referred to it as. And the room houses Webster Knight's personal library. The photograph of Robert Knight was taken down for the purpose of photographing it here. And finally, this is the stained glass that appears in the window in that room. Obviously, a knight in shining armor. So a front view of the library. Again, I ask you all to come back and visit us and enjoy visits to the library and to the Elmwood neighborhood and to the wonderful selection of architecture that we have here. Thank you very much.